So that's where we're at right now. That's how I see the line of connection. And you've told us why you're into law. So tell me about this. You've got the first one being driving over the limits. Of course, that's going to be a problem, and you get into the specifics there. So, but it's not the same thing, cannabis and alcohol. And I want to know from where comes the directive? From where comes the overarching reason and means to say, oh, this substance is just like this substance? I mean, we're not talking about a very similar item at all. Not molecularly, not in how it affects you, and not in how it supposedly impairs you. So how can you just take a series of laws that are built around something else, and then it's supposed to be okay? How does that work?
It's really interesting because the rationale for these regulations, driving over the 2 nanograms per milliliter of blood and getting a summary charge for that, that's really something that it has sprung up not because of impairment per se, but because consuming some could lead to impairment. But they're not saying that the 2 nanogram per milliliter mark is because you might be impaired on it. It's the government has said they're taking a precautious approach. So it's very interesting that
pre-crime.
Yeah, it's very interesting that they're not taking. They're saying, on one hand, if you have 5 nanograms per milliliter, which is when you actually can go to jail.
In Canada.
Yes.
But in some other places, that's the upper limit.
Well, so some other places have 5 nanograms per milliliter as the threshold, and that's what I would argue is more sane.
Because how much is a nanogram? Like, what are we talking about? The word nano means so freaking tiny you can't see it. Gram is already a small thing no matter what. How big is a nanogram? What does it mean?
Well, let's just say that there have been studies to show how much cannabis is in an individual after stopping using cannabis. And from what the studies say, if you ingest oral marijuana, so that's you eat it, sprays, whatever, and then you stop. If you were a heavy user, it might appear in your bloodstream at or above 2 nanograms 7 days later. That's if you eat it or ingest it. 7 days. 7 days later.
But how big is it? Like, do this. How big is a nanogram? What, you see this?
Oh, I'm not sure. It's got to be really tiny because it's in blood too, so it's got to be a little.
So if you're going to again, I understand that stuff, but if you're going to say, okay, we've already got in any jurisdiction in the world, pretty much, we have laws on how we distribute and control and profit from the sales, etc. Blah, 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 of alcohol, liquor, booze, beer, whatever. That's a thing. How can you then take that template and drop it on top of cannabis when they're so remarkably different as a substance? And because if you're going to do that, let me finish this point. If you're going to do that, it's 0.8 alcohol, right? It's 0.8 blood is the driving.
That's right. Yeah.
0.8 what versus 0.2 nanograms? Why wouldn't it be 0.8 nanograms? You know what I mean? Like every word's convenient to screw us over with some liberty being slashed or whatever it is. We go with the alcohol, right, system. And every time there's not a similarity, well, we're just going to go with the alcohol anyway. And we're going to make it even lower. And okay, I got another question as well about that. But let me hear what I want to understand this nanogram thing, because this is scary as shit. When I first looked up nanogram, I couldn't even find up decent enough information to tell me how much that is. But if you smoked a joint outside and I walked past and sneezed or coughed or something like this and inhaled your expelling of smoke, that might be enough for me to get pulled over. That might be enough in my blood.
I can't say whether that is fact or not. There have been some studies done into hotboxing scenarios, and that would be a creative defense if someone did say that was the case. But you're right, they are 2 different substances. You don't have that correlation coefficient where if you're drinking this much alcohol, you will for sure have this much increased risk of having a traffic accident, let's say. Cannabis, it's a bit different. There's been some impairment found at 2 nanograms. There's been studies that say there is no impairment at that level. There's other studies that sort of find that there was no or a very small amount of increased risk of an accident with cannabis. So it's very mixed. The science is very mixed, whereas the science for alcohol is clear. So that much I'll say. And I'll just mention to your point about 0.08 versus 0.2. There's no way to reliably detect THC consumption. So
I know. So they just say, okay, we don't know what we're doing. We'll just make it like weed. We'll make it like booze.
Well, if you can see any silver lining in it, it's that the government has released regulations pursuant to this legislation with regards to blood limits of other drugs. So if you're tested, blood tested, and they're not just going to test for the THC, I presume they're probably going to test for all other drugs.
Sure.
If you have any psilocybin or LSD or this sort of heroin metabolite, you will be convicted of the crime. So
what if I have Ativan in me?
Ativan. I don't think that's not one of the drugs that are being tested.
Of course not. No, I could be half asleep on a friggin' prescription drug, and it's not going to be a problem.
Benzos are not covered, for example, and it's very interesting. They focused on these 7 drugs specifically. I don't know why. Maybe that's because those are the drugs that maybe there's no legal versions of them, so therefore they're only going to focus on the ones that are illegal. But with cannabis, it's at least 2 nanograms and not just 0.
Okay, so then you get to the science. I don't know how much you know about the science. I know more than I used to, and not enough, not as much as I'm going to. But okay, so basically the implication being that cannabis is probably more dangerous and more unhealthy than tobacco. Would you say that's the case, legally speaking? In a legal sense? And I'll tell you why specifically I asked that sense. Because if tobacco is so bad, again, they take the template of booze, they take the template of tobacco, they take the worst elements of that, the most repressive elements of that, and slap it on a substance that doesn't have those markers. And so by doing that, you are creating a completely false paradigm of legal prosecution. You shouldn't be doing that at all. And not you personally, of course, but personally, on a personal level, doesn't it kind of, you might have to take your lawyer hat off here. Don't you find that when you wake up to a series of, you love law, okay, great, but if you wake up to a series of convolutions that are going to take so long to unravel, and most of the time there will be infringements on people's rights, and as soon as I arrest you for something, now your mom's upset, now you got to go to the courthouse, now all this series of things that go down because of a series of decisions, which is the legal system, made by people that we can now see are not necessarily based in fact. Okay, so how can you say, oh, you've got that stuff in your system, it's not very good, it's bad, so we're going to come up with this new thing, this new series of rules where if you're going to take it, okay, but do it at home, and you don't get to go anywhere else and do it, and that's that. Well, they're not saying that about cigarettes, are they?
Yeah, well, part of this is that there's two levels of government, the province and the feds, that are both making regulations, and sometimes they overlap.
I don't know why. Kathleen Wynne, the Premier of Ontario, and her team have been working on this for a year, getting it right. And as soon as she announces it the next day, the cops go, no, we won't be ready. So you didn't work on it for a year. Or you did a shitty job working on it for a year.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that when you have these 2 different levels of government on top of each other, they're putting
or 3
or 3, because the city's going to come in. They might regulate, let's say, home cultivation. So there could be a 3rd layer of government, and it is remarkable that the federal government has continued this criminalized approach, when they even said that, and even in the preamble of this bill, it says that one of the objectives is to reduce reliance on the criminal justice system. Well, right now we have about 7 offenses you can be charged with under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act for marijuana. Yeah. Under the new legislation, there's going to be about 45 offenses.
Yeah, let's get to that. We got a table here you've compiled.
That's a great table. That's a table by Ottawa lawyer Trina Fraser.
Trina Fraser. Okay, so I've inadvertently snipped the top off, but this is basically, it says here, this is how it was or is, and this is how it's going to be.
No, these are actually all of the, this is actually the offense.
Yeah.
So these are all 45 or so of the offenses, and
and
this
those are
is the punishment.
Oh, because it had "or" so many times, I wasn't sure. So that's going to be up to the discretion of the magistrate.
So it'll
the
be
judge?
up to the discretion for some of these offenses. It's very interesting. So we have offenses that have both a 14-year maximum imprisonment, which is huge.
14 years, yeah.
Yeah, and what that does is the judge's hands are tied in a sense because they can't give a conditional sentence or a discharge, whether absolute or conditional discharge, to an individual if they're prosecuted via an indictable offense that has a 14-year maximum. So it's very strange. It's many of these offenses, half of them it seems, have this 14-year imprisonment maximum. They've gotten rid of.
It's 2 legal lifetimes, isn't it?
Yeah, they've got rid of the mandatory minimum. So you can't face a mandatory minimum under the new law when it does get passed. But you can face 14 years max imprisonment, and if the judge does not have the discretion to issue a discharge or conditional sentence, it's sort of like this quid pro quo. The Liberals are saying, we'll get rid of mandatory minimums, but we'll also make it tough on the consumer too.
So to get my way through this, a mandatory minimum then is a thing where if you break some law, at least 6 months or at least a year or whatever it is, right? But now they don't have that. And maybe the same law where you might have got 6 months, a year, 18 months before, and now I'm the judge, and now there's no mandatory minimum, and I don't like you, and now you're going to get 3 years, or 10 years, or 14 years.
Well, that could be the case, but judges lawyers submit case law to say, look, this is a proper range, and maybe the judge will side on one side or the other, somewhere in the middle. But judges don't like being overturned, so usually they'll sort of stick with what is good practice in the courts. But anything's possible. I mean, I remember reading a case where an individual had 6 what the judge called super marijuana plants, and this guy went to jail for a number of months. And now that's almost going to be fully legal. They've just removed, going forward, the 100-centimeter limit in report
for the height of a plant.
Parliament for the height of a plant, and so we'll see what happens in that respect. But it's certainly very interesting. There's some areas that are not criminalized, and there's some areas that are criminalized a lot. Like, for example, you're going to be able to have unlimited amount of marijuana at home.
Unlimited at home.
At home, so you can have like a wine cellar of marijuana if you want. But the moment you go outside to the public, you can only have 30 grams of dried marijuana or the equivalent. So it's very interesting. In some respects, it's a permissive law, and you can, as long as you don't use an organic solvent, you can.
What does that mean? An organic solvent? That sounds like a good solvent. It sounds like water. What is that?
Well, that's something like butane.
Okay.
I'm not a scientist. I'm trying to figure out if that includes alcohol. I think it does include alcohol, but I'm not sure.
It does include alcohol? Because 99% alcohol is what I used.
Yeah, well, I'm not a scientist, and I've been trying to get to the bottom of that. I haven't been aware of. I have not been aware of any prosecutions for using alcohol.
I'm going to be scared.
Could be argued, though.
I'm going to be scared if I'm the first judge to put you away for 14 years. I don't want to be that judge. I don't want to be that lawyer. He's going to get overturned. Fuck these idiots. You can't put a guy in jail for 14 years. Let's for that. And like I say, 2 legal lifetime. You're in the 7-year cycle of life and regenerate yourself. So you're supposed to do 2. So give me a couple of these laws that have a version or something similar today that's going to go away and be replaced by this that has a particularly heinous penalty. Give me an example of what you think are particularly deep, dark danks of stench on this.
So possession is actually going to be removed as an offense, but you can be charged with possession of illicit cannabis. So if you know that your cannabis was grown by someone who grew more than 4 plants, or they weren't supposed to grow it, or if it's illicit cannabis by the definition of the law, that's going to be a new offense. So that sort of replaces the possession offense. Right. So possession in public over 30 grams, that's an offense. Possession of illicit cannabis, that's an offense. So you had individuals like Jody Emery go up to the committee. I believe it was Jody Emery, or it could have been Dana Larson, who said this joint, this law doesn't even legalize the joint I have in my pocket, and that's
Right.
because it's ostensibly from a dispensary, one of the ones that are not legal at this time. So it's weird. You'll if you know that it's illicit cannabis, if you go to a dispensary and you know it's not one of the legal dispensaries, you could be charged and go to jail for up to 5 years, or you could get a ticket. That's really up to the discretion of the
Okay,
cops.
great. So if I do go to the liquor store to buy liquor, am I okay to buy like 3 cases of beer, 4 magnums of champagne, a thing of scotch, a thing of vodka, and I mean like, a fifth, a pounder, a big 750
I do
kind of
not
thing,
know of any law that prevents you from doing so.
and a case of beer and some wine and some shooters and stuff like this, and I've got a shopping cart and I'm pushing it down the street. Is that okay?
I don't know of any law against that.
So once again, then we have this thing where we're going to treat it like booze. We're going to treat it like this. Oh, except for when it's okay to carry booze around. More than 30 ounces of booze is okay, right? More than 30 grams of booze is okay, right? Whatever that works out to. And then you get
doesn't
back
make
to
much sense.
No, and then you get back to the fact that an ounce, which is the old metric systems, replaced that in Canada, but in other places in the States, I guess they still use ounces. But an ounce works out to 28.5 grams or something. And some arbitrary pencil pusher decided, you know what? Let's give them 30. Let's just round it up to 30 because I think 28.5 is going to be a screwed up. Let's be benevolent enough to say you can have 1 ounce of a thing that apparently you can grow tons of in your house, and guys are walking around with booze in a cart while they're smoking cigarettes, which is supposed to be as much or more so dangerous than cannabis, but you can smoke cigarettes anywhere you want, like 9 meters away from a doorway, fine, outside, no problem. That's the only place left. Do that with a joint, you're in trouble because joints are different than booze, and booze is different than cigarettes. But again, we're taking all the worst repressive aspects of these 2 other controlled substances and slapping it on something while we skip over the facts of how this stuff is. And listen, this whole thing, folks, if you're listening to us now on Green Crush, you're probably wondering how you came across that information. Maybe your friend is dying from cancer and wants to research what I did to get out of that particular pickle. That's what we do on this show. It's at Green Crush Pod. If you can find us, we're speaking now with Harrison Jordan, who will soon, probably the next time he's on the show, he'll be a lawyer. Maybe before that, but slightly. You just admitted how stupid it is.
I do have serious issues with the Cannabis Act as it's being proposed.
How are you going to hold your emotions in check when you're in court speaking with some obtuse judge that doesn't want to be overturned on a silly law that you know in your deeper inner brain? This is totally fucked. I can't believe this guy's going along with this. I can't believe this dude of mine's in trouble. I can't believe I got to say these things. I can't believe these stupid laws. Can't believe I'm trying to help this guy out who got busted for 32 grams of pot instead of 30. How do you contain that shit when you're in the court situation?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of head-scratching court cases that I've either been involved or observed where, I mean, there was one where it was actually reported on in the Globe and Mail. He was a single father who grew, I think it was 29 plants, and the Crown was seeking the mandatory minimum. Because the mandatory minimum, you can sometimes, they don't actually have to seek it. So it's mandatory if the Crown wants it to be. Right, so
this is an arbitrary nature of things.
Fortunately, they're getting rid of that, but obviously, I have my own reservations with the legislation. But in that point, he actually he had shown that he hadn't consumed cannabis after that. He had stayed away from cannabis. He had a daughter, and the Children's Aid Society said, we'll support whatever happens. And this is a letter in support of him, and all of these things that really were in his favor, but the Crown still went ahead with pursuing a mandatory minimum. It wasn't until we had myself and Alan Young. I was working for Alan Young at the time. It was only when we had come up with the constitutional challenge and said we're going to challenge this did they actually pull it. So now they still wanted him in for 6 months, but they weren't gonna go for the mandatory minimum. They can sort of insulate themselves from a challenge if they so fit. Is it abusive process? I don't know. Some people might say that. I wouldn't go that far, but it's something that's concerning that they can, once they know that they're being challenged on a law, they can just drop the case, or in this case, not pursue the mandatory minimum.
And these are all the decisions and actions coming from the very clean and clear, unfettered, undamaged minds of these legislators, right? Like, you're sitting here telling me that these things are so crazy and so out of whack and head scratching, and you don't know how to figure it out, and you can't. It's a friggin' mess. You could just label it as a friggin' mess, and it's a friggin' mess. And it's all purportedly coming from clear-thinking, sensible people who don't partake in cannabis and think it's a bad idea. And they offer this barf soup of nonsense. And then they're going to sit here and tell us how crazy we are for using cannabis.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm really concerned about is the fact that some of the offenses have the ability, the government has the ability, the law enforcement has the ability to give out tickets. And those tickets, if you're convicted, would not go on your criminal record. But that's really up to the discretion of a police officer on the street. And we know that it's going to disproportionately affect people of color. Yeah, and that's what's going to happen, unfortunately.
Well, it's also a 1978 Steve Martin joke. So we haven't really made a lot of progress in some areas that, oh, no, I wouldn't smoke marijuana. You can get a ticket for that. And everyone laughs because it was 40 years ago. All right. On the silly note, and these 5 things, and I'm sure there are more now. You wrote this in June. So here's one. Number 2, this is not going to be okay. Public display of cannabis accessories, such as bongs and pipes. You know, the means to consume it, in the windowsills of shops. Why not?
Well, the new law, the old law, I'll step back and say the old law actually does technically criminalize the sale of bongs, but it's not enforced. The new law doesn't criminalize the sale of bongs and pipes per se, but it does criminalize the promotion of it and the public display of it. So there's a lot of
the promotion of
cannabis accessories, and also the promotion of cannabis-based, cannabis-related services. So in the article, I touch upon the accessories, but it's also going to touch upon anyone that has a service that's related to cannabis. So it's a really far-reaching law. They're not saying you can't put it in front of someone's face, but they are restricting what you can do.
The actual cannabis.
They're restricting the actual cannabis and the cannabis accessories where those can be shown, so they can't be shown where a young person might be.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what. I am trying to make it clear to people. This is the mission statement of the show. I'm trying to make it clear to people that despite the fact that they might think it seems like a series of crazy conspiracies, that I actually did come down with stage 4 cancer, and I actually am not suffering from that right now because I used cannabis. And I am telling people, because it was a hell ride for a lot of it, medically speaking particularly, I am trying to tell people how to cut through a lot of that brush. I want to be a trailblazer because I went through that. That was a shitty ride, and I know that I learned a lot of things. I wrote a lot of things down. And if I had to do it all over again, which I don't want to do, it would be much easier for me this time. And I am trying to bring that to the listeners. I'm trying to bring that way. It's the 4th door, I call it, to the 5th stage. There's no such thing as stage 5 cancer. Exactly. So am I promoting cannabis illegally while I sit here in this window?
Well, there are. I have to take a look at the legislation to see if you fit in one of the exceptions. I know one of the exceptions is if it's a theatrical production, then the laws don't apply. But or that's an exemption to the promotion law.
Was that what Alex Jones did in the States? Pretty much, he said, "No, I'm a performance artist. I don't really believe these things."
Oh, I'm not sure.
Didn't hear about that? Okay.
No, I wouldn't put it past him to say that, though.
So, yeah, false promotion is prohibited in the new law. So promotion, was the definition of that is the promotion of cannabis use?
No, that would be promoting the product.
Okay.
So now false promotion will be illegal.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter who you're getting it from. If they say it's one strain, but really it's the other. I mean, you'll be getting it from a store. That's where you have to get it from, or grow it yourself. But if you get it from a store, they can't falsely promote.
Okay.
it.
So now that I have this legally obtained non-illicit or licit cannabis, but, you know, an officer sees me standing at a streetcar stop or bus stop or whatever it is, and let's go talk to that guy with the long hair.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a real thing? And he says, let me see, where'd you get this cannabis? Where'd you get it? Where's it from? And then it boils down this series of questions that I have obtained illegal cannabis. There I am smoking a joint. How is he gonna tell the difference between something that's I'm not supposed to have, an illicit substance, and something that I am supposed to have, which maybe came from an LP or whatever they want me to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's very...
Like, you can tell if a guy's drunk, but you can't tell exactly what kind of booze the guy drank.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Well, the fact that you will be allowed to grow up to 4 plants really throws a wrench into this notion of illicit cannabis and how law enforcement is going to be able to distinguish illicit cannabis from licit.
Mm-hmm.
My first thoughts on this, when I first saw it, was that, wow, there's going to be a presumption that if you're carrying cannabis that's not in a sales container, that's not an official sales container, and it's just in some Ziploc bag, there might be a presumption that that's illicit cannabis. But now that you're able to grow up to 4 plants, it's going to be much harder to say that cannabis was illicit. I think that they'll probably reserve that offense for when there's large quantities, when someone's doing large scale distribution. It's very, I mean, it's very disconcerting that even if you have under 30 grams of illicit cannabis, that'll be a crime. You can go to jail for 5 years, or you can
14.
get a ticket.
Or 14 or 5.
Five for possessing just illicit cannabis, but if you're doing stuff like distribution or anything or other offenses involving plants, those are closer to 14 or 7. Yeah.
Okay. Here's this guy stealing an office chair there. Let me ask you this. In that, I believe there is a series of premises upon which these newer laws and acknowledgments of use of cannabis are built. There's a certain understanding. That's what the HESA hearings were all about. Those politicians, we're trying to learn about what this thing is so we can make up a bunch of laws about it. How can you make up a series of laws like this with 14-year penalties, et cetera, when you don't have, you're not seeming to use the most accessible and easy to find scientific data on what a healthful property it is? I don't know how you can pretend that this stuff doesn't work when there have been articles as far back as, at least in the modern times, into the 90s, the big one on November 4th, 2001, from The Guardian in England, about how we're beyond the hearsay zone. We're beyond the, what do they call it when people say, well, it's anecdotal. Isn't there something about anecdotes coming up over and over again where it's now upon you to have to investigate these things? As a possibility, because then you're going to wind up going, hey, this is good for this, it's good for that. Let's make a bunch of laws against it.
Yeah, unfortunately, the bureaucrats and the politicians still see it as a harmful substance. They're still criminalizing it as if it's a public harm. But you know, if they really thought it was a public harm, they should treat it with other initiatives other than the criminal justice system. It's kind of remarkable because, again, as I said, there's 45 new offenses, and these are offenses that the federal government could have at least said to the provinces, why don't you formulate your own offenses, because those offenses won't go on your sort of federal criminal record.
Okay, we're going to put a pause in here for a second.
Sure.